I think that a ban, like all bans, it sort of draws a line in the sand and it polarizes people. And all of these issues are issues where people need to come together. Oil palm is an amazingly sustainable product. It produces over and over and over again for 25 years on an incredibly quick cycle. You harvest every 20 days, and it occupies a fraction of the total area to produce the same amount of oil as other vegetable oils. So I don't think the plant, oil palm, is the enemy. I think that this, as in all problems, are people problems. So it's how we apportion the land, and it's how we responsibly manage the land that is the issue. So where we have already converted and where we're already producing oil palm is great. Do we need more expansion in the range of the orangutan habitat? Perhaps, as a person who cares about orangutans, I would say I would hope not. In the space of one orangutan lifetime, which is a little over 50 years, they've gone from having a very ample forest to now forest fragments. Orangutans require the diversity of a natural forest. So you don't have any forest, you don't have any orangutans. But what we are finding is that orangutans have done their best to maintain their community structure across these small forest islands. And the normal orangutan community is that orangutan females own the land, they own the resources. This makes sense because they are responsible for 7 years to look after a dependent. And then that dependent spends another 7 years in their mother's neighborhood, essentially. And then the females stay for the rest of their life in their mother's neighborhood, and the males leave. And this is where we are finding that orangutan males need to use these small forests that are dotted across the landscape as rest stations, or as I always say to the plantation, these are their B&Bs on the way between one larger forest to the other forests, and they depend on these. Males are actually able to be crossing this landscape, mostly undetected. And then the other absolutely gobsmacking finding is that there's more females in the landscape that have survived on the privately administered landscape than I expected. And they are raising their babies in these small forests that look like they're completely isolated. But when an orangutan makes a mistake, perhaps, and is seen in the middle of an oil palm plantation, maybe 5, 10, 15 kilometers from a forest, logically, the oil palm grower or the estate thinks this orangutan must be desperately lost because he's far away from a forest. When in actuality, we know an orangutan male can easily cross 5 kilometers and more in a day. So there's shock. And, you know, maybe the international audience doesn't understand that people in Malaysia like orangutans too, and they're very proud of their natural heritage and the fact that they are home to some of the last remaining wild orangutans. Most of the growers I've encountered, they're trying to actually do the best thing for the animal. They think that the animal must be lost and it needs to be taken away and put somewhere else. When actually what the orangutan is trying to do is he's going on a regular route to where he knows there's another place to be, or there used to be another place to be. Because that's another thing we see is that often orangutans are seen in the oil palm landscape up on hillside areas. And I've even had workers tell me it's almost like they're looking out, you know. So that's one of the types of things that I'm doing now in the landscape, is trying to map these areas where orangutan males really need to go and need to see as a vantage point to get in the landscape. So actually on the ground, what I'm finding is estate managers in the Kinabatangan region anyway, seem to have a great interest. When I go in and I say, well, there's sign of orangutans in this little forest patch, they say, we had no idea. And the idea is that a very small forest isn't useful to such a large animal as this. So this is really sort of a mind-blowing idea that they can actually be contributors. Now, actually doing this practically is difficult, and how much investment it will require, you know, of staff to help to learn to monitor orangutans really varies from estate to estate. But the commitment, I think, is really there. And there's one really great example of this type of commitment. One of our early engagement companies, it was quite clear that orangutan access across a small tributary in their estate was a problem for males to cross across this area. So they invested in building some orangutan bridges. Then they invested in camera traps to try to monitor that their investment had given them something. And I, as a conservation practitioner, was a bit nervous about this because orangutans cannot swim, so they're very shy of using a bridge. In my experience, they've not used bridges for sometimes years after they've been put up. So we put this camera trap up, and after only about 7 months, we have evidence of quite regular use. So this makes the estate very happy, and it makes them understand that orangutans are there and that they can do something that's relatively simple to make an impact. And then that helps to encourage their neighbors to have this more positive feeling. This is not perhaps the ideal landscape for wildlife, but it is the reality of the landscape we have now. I think as a conservation biologist, you have to recognize that people are part of that equation. So we need to work together. So my biggest challenge has not been so much the industry understanding. My biggest challenge is really a little bit more in my fellow conservation biologists, both nationally and internationally, who are more skeptical that animals can be flexible and that it's okay to engage with an industry. I think we have to be realistic. This is the way the landscape is now. People expect that everybody has been studying this and has solutions already, but actually people have been not studying this and really not taking an evidence-based approach. And this is one of the driving forces of what I want to do, is expanding the capacity of Malaysian scientists and Indonesian scientists, where orangutans also live, to be on the forefront of the conservation of their own species. And again, for this kind of approaches of much more adaptive management of how we manage wild populations to stay living in the wild.